consumer confidence, Conference Board's consumer confidence index in June fell to 98.7 from 103.2 in May. Expectation was 100, so it's under the expectation. The expectation index, so when you look at consumer confidence, there's two. Your confidence in the present situation, that's the blue on the chart. And then there's your expectations of the future. And what you see is a huge divergence there starting to happen. People are starting to look towards the future as negative, but they feel pretty good about today. And so, gentlemen, what do you think of this chart?
It seems to me like this is sort of akin to what Sachs was relaying about that founder at the Co2 conference, which is like, he thinks everybody else is going to, roll up their sleeves and buckle down, but he has no intention of doing it. I think people are roughly the same way. And I think their behavior is, well, if things are going to get hard, I'll deal with it in the future. But right now I have money in my pocket. And, if you look at airlines and how many people are trying to travel, if you just look at like the cost of a hotel room, if you look at what's happening this summer, it does not seem like people are slowing down or tapping the brakes in any way.
Yeah.
This is where I get concerned about credit because it's not coming from wage gains. The increased cost is there. The increased income is not. And, we're seeing continued month after month increases in consumer credit balances. And that I think, this was the point I made a few episodes ago was I don't think people are going to slow down how they're living and how they're spending.
It's exactly what the data is showing.
There's an inertia. There's
Actually,
a lifestyle
I don't know
inertia.
about that. I don't know.
Well,
about that.
I just think after 2 years of a lockdown, I do think that people are anxious to reestablish some amount of normalcy. And this is really the first summer where everybody writ large can be out and do the things that they were planning on doing. Last year
was the head fake summer, yeah.
Last year was a little bit of a head fake. And look, you have 2 years of pent up plans of,
Weddings.
50th anniversaries and weddings and all of this stuff that's happening. Yeah. And so I think people are really spending money.
And if you look at it, the consumer is holding up amazingly. It's got to be some combination of jobs, home prices, and this inflation.
But this is why there has not been a downtick in demand. I don't know why everybody thinks that there's been a downtick in demand.
It hasn't.
There was an article today.
Up in the numbers yet. It's not showing up in the numbers yet.
No, I think it is.
Then it's just anecdotal and guessing.
It's very subtle. Okay, sure. It is. There is a subtle.
I actually disagree with you guys. I actually think that the economy is pivoting on a dime here, and it's starting to show up subtly in the numbers. Here's some other data points. Consumer sentiment. Biggest drop in consumer sentiment in 40 years. That was in the last month. Right track, wrong track polling. Only 10% of the country thinks we're on the right track. If you poll people and ask, are we in a recession? Something like close to 60% of the country already thinks we're in a recession. There's a slight political tint to that. More Republicans than Democrats think we're in a recession. However, even roughly half of Democrats think we're in a recession. So I think
those are all feelings, not behavior, though, Sachs. We're looking at the data, not the sentiment.
I think the behavior will catch up with the sentiment. I think I think the behavior is pivoting.
Yeah.
It's just that I think you have to dig beneath the surface and you have to look at things like retail sales, things like that.
I'm not sure, David, if you look back on all the number of times consumer sentiment has dipped, that the correlation to spending patterns is so uniformly predictive as we think. I mean, I think that there's a slight positive correlation, I remember, but I don't think it's like, 0.75, 0.8, 1. It's not that. So there's this weird preference falsification that happens when you get asked, what do you think is going to happen versus then what do you do? Yeah. And I think a lot of consumers, that's why they have, we know the data in America, like less than a month of savings or whatever those numbers are. Despite all of the sentiment analysis and all of this stuff, you would think that there'd be behavior change, but mostly people kind of just live in the moment. And, that's partly because they don't have the structural support to save or other things. But the reality is that most folks, from what they say to what they behave, there is a gap.
Yeah. And to your point, Sachs, this is starting to catch up. We're seeing a slight downtick, and we'll go to real estate next. But if you look, I was doing some research on gasoline, because that's obviously where people are getting hit the most. The average household is now spending $5,000 a year on gasoline. That's almost double last year. So this is going to have an impact. It's going to catch up. But there's so many jobs available and there's so many people unemployed. I think it's manageable. So to your point, Chamath, it feels like consumers can manage even this great headwind.
Let me just put a point to it. I think the average per capita income in the U.S. is about $38,000 a year. That works out to about $17.50 an hour, roughly. Think about a person with that level of earnings. The average household in the U.S. has historically, spent about a third on housing, about 13% on food, and about 16% on, their car and their gas. And they only have about 12% left over for savings. So, if that 13% on food has jumped by 30%, the 16% that they're spending on gas has jumped by 40% or 50%. And even if housing prices tick up a little bit, all of a sudden your savings are gone and you're actually not saving.
The gas has actually doubled, Friedberg. It's doubled the gas. So, yeah.
By the way, it's worse than you say. No, it's worse than you say because you're using a per capita number.
Yeah. And so but I think what I'm trying to highlight is that there is a distribution. There is a group of the United States, a small percentage, a minority, that have earned good income and are having their 50th anniversary, like Chamath is talking about, taking their travel. And that shows up in the numbers. There's outsized spending happening with a segment of the economy. And what Sachs is saying, I think, is right as well, which is that the majority of Americans are facing this really critical budget crisis where their personal spending levels are now exceeding their income levels. And there's a critical need for credit and for personal debt and spending to go down. And that's what's going to drive significant risk in the next couple of months and quarters and years. Is that the majority, some of the numbers will look good because there's a segment of the economy that is overspending, but the majority of the economy is, as Sachs is saying, probably turning on a dime. And I think both things can be true.
Yeah, let me maybe tie a couple of these things together because I tend to agree with you. Like, I think that we have been in a supply side recession. That is what has caused inflation. We have to go through a process of taking all the excess money that's been put in out. And when you do that, we will destroy demand. And then that'll trigger a demand side recession because people
will destroy asset values.
And we will destroy asset values. So
we started that process. Asset values went real quick. Yeah.
That will happen second.
So the balance sheets of that segment of the population that is overspending right now, once their balance sheets really take the hit and they take a hard look at what their savings are, they're going to cut spending.
Right. Yeah, but the point is, I think we're still firmly in that first phase. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the reason why I think that we're still in the first part of this process is because people, broadly speaking, still have a lot of savings because of all the stimulus checks. There is still a lot of money. So how will we know, maybe is the better point, when all of that excess savings has been, torn away from these people because of high prices? I suspect it's when Jason's first chart starts to close, right? So when people are, they're more motivated to re-enter the workforce. I think that's a signal. Friedberg, your signal is another one, which is when credit delinquencies really start to spike. It's because people then, tapped out their savings, then they tap their credit cards, and then all of a sudden they become delinquent. When all of those things happen, you're probably now at a point where that first phase of the supply side issues are largely done, and now you get to the demand destruction. But all of those roads, unfortunately, lead to the same conclusion, which is like, equities get really under pressure. There is no scenario where there's a bid to equities. Why would you buy something that has lower earnings in the future?